Genetics and heredity. So what is genetics? Genetics is the study of how traits are passed from parent to offspring. Heredity is the passing of traits from parent to offspring. So really, genetics is the study of heredity. A trait is referring to the characteristic of an organism, and alleles are different forms of the same trait. So traits we might look at would be blood types or dimples, and you can have different forms of blood types, and you can have different forms of dimples. So those are the different alleles of those traits. So the first person who really studied genetics was Gregor Mendel. He was an Austrian monk in the 1860s, and he worked as a gardener. Now, while working as a gardener, he noticed that pea plants passed traits on from one generation to the next. And the more he studied them, the more he learned. And pea plants were ideal because they have a perfect flower with easily seen reproductive organs. They have traits that occur in just two forms. They are easily cross-pollinated by hand, and they easily grow and produce lots of offspring in one generation. So Mendel started his pea plant experiment, and he wanted to look at height of plants. And all pea plants are either tall or short. There's no in between. And he worked with only purebred plants. Now the word purebred is referring to organisms that always produce offspring with the same trait as the parent. So he has his purebred plants. He's got one that's tall and one that's short, and he crosses them, and lo and behold, all of the offspring are tall, which is not what he expected since one of the plants he started with was short. So then he took these two tall plants and he crossed them. And in this generation, he came up with both tall and short plants. Well, that's weird, right? Because there were no short parents, and yet they had a short offspring. So he needed to answer the question, how does a trait disappear during one generation and reappear in the next generation? And he came to the following conclusions. Traits are determined by a pair of factors, and each parent must contribute one factor. And he decided that a factor could be either strong or weak, which brings us to the modern vocabulary of genetics. What Mendel was calling a factor, we now call a gene. Okay, and a gene is a unit of material that determines a trait. What Mendel saw as different forms of the gene, we call alleles. What Mendel thought was the strong form, we now call the dominant gene. Okay, the gene trait shows if the dominant gene is present. And what Mendel thought was the weak form, we call the recessive gene. Okay, so that gene trait is hidden if the dominant gene is present, and it will only show if there's no dominant gene there. So the words genotype and phenotype are referring to traits in the organism. So phenotype is the trait that shows up. Genotype is the actual gene combination. If you have two alleles that are exactly the same, we say it is homozygous. So all purebred organisms are homozygous. And the word homo means same, and hetero means different. That's why heterozygous means you have two different alleles for a trait. All hybrid organisms are heterozygous. And we'll spend some time in class talking about this terminology. So it's okay if you're a little confused right now. So here we've got a pea plant, and it is definitely tall, but we don't know its genotype. You can't tell from looking at an organism if it is purebred or hybrid necessarily. So this could be either homozygous, dominant, right, two capital T's, or it could be heterozygous or a hybrid. So we use symbols in genetics, and these symbols are representing different alleles. Dominant alleles are represented by capital letters. Recessive alleles are represented by lowercase letters. And each parent contributes one allele. Okay, and we use those letters to represent what trait or allele is being passed on by parents. So looking at Mendel's pea plant experiment, remember we've got capital T's for tall and lowercase t's for short. So we've got the parent generation. He took a purebred tall plant and a purebred short plant and crossed them. Their offspring were all tall. However, since you get one allele from each parent, all of those offspring must have been hybrids. Then we took these two hybrids and they were crossed, and the offspring were both tall and short. Now, Mendel would have had to figure out which gene came from each parent, and we now use a process called Punnett square to figure out what each of these gene combinations would be. And again, we'll talk about that more in class. So some principles of genetics. The traits of an organism pass from the parent to the offspring. Gene combination is what determines traits. Organisms inherit genes in pairs, one gene from each parent. Genes are either dominant or recessive. Dominant genes hide recessive genes. And some genes are codominant. We will talk about codominant in another week or so.